Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take these huge philosophical riddles, stack up all the sources we can find, and try to build a bit of a shortcut to really knowing what you're talking about. Today, we are wrestling with a question that is, it's just so fundamental. It sounds really simple, almost like something out of a children's story, but it's at the heart of centuries of arguments about ethics. And the question is it bad to be bad?
Right.
Now, obviously, if you just define bad as morally bad, then the question answers itself. It's a loop. But that's not what we're really asking. What we're trying to do is bridge this gap between, how we judge other people's actions and how we should live our own lives.
Yeah.
We're asking, when we say an action is morally wrong, as something that we all sort of condemn, is that action also guaranteed to be harmful to the person who does it? Does being a bad person, morally speaking, mean you're destined to have a bad life, personally?
And that ambiguity is exactly where all the interesting philosophy starts. To get anywhere, we have to pull those two kinds of badness apart. First, you have the system everyone knows, moral badness. This is the judgment we make when someone, lies or steals or hurts someone. These are the rules about our duties to other people, often no matter what it costs us personally.
And then the other side of the coin, which is so important for today's deep dive, is prudential badness. This is all about the self.
Exactly. The sources define this as anything that is, when you weigh it all up, harmful to your own welfare, your own long-term interests.
It's just about expediency, really.
Yes. If I decide to eat a massive pizza right before I run a marathon, that's prudentially bad for me. It's a dumb move, it's self-sabotage, but there are no, moral victims.
Right.
And the big dream in philosophy, this goes all the way back to Plato, has been to prove that these two systems are actually the same thing. That being morally bad has to cause prudential badness.
Because if you could prove that, you've got this perfect universal reason to be good.
You've got it. The right way to live for others is also the only rational way to live for yourself.
The so-called holy grail of ethics. But our mission today is to put that idea to the test using the most cynical and skeptical tool we have in the philosophical toolbox, moral error theory.
Right. This is the philosophy that says moral facts just don't exist.
So if we completely remove moral truth from the equation, can self-interest prudence actually step in and do the same job? We're going to find out if prudence can ever really be morality, or if it's always just, a cheap imitation.
The schmorality.
A schmorality,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So let's just unpack this position. It's pretty radical. A moral error theorist isn't just someone who doesn't follow the rules. They're making a really deep claim about reality itself.
Yeah, that's a vital point. They're not just saying, I don't care about morality. They're saying the entire system of moral language is built on a fundamental mistake.
It's important to distinguish them from, say, non-cognitivists.
Oh, absolutely. A non-cognitivist thinks a statement like stealing is wrong is just an emotional outburst. It's like shouting, boo, stealing.
Yeah.
It's not meant to be true or false.
But the error theorist thinks it is meant to be true or false.
Yes. They think it's a real claim about the world. It just happens to be false every single time. And they get there with 3 critical steps.
Okay, what's step 1?
Step 1, moral words like is morally bad or is right are real logical predicates. They work just like is blue or is heavy. They're supposed to be describing a feature of an action or a person.
Step 2. When we use these words, when we say that was wrong, we're saying it with esoteric force. We're not just giving an opinion.
Exactly. We're asserting it as a fact. We're making what's supposed to be a factual judgment about reality, one that demands other people agree.
And then comes the punchline.
And here's the punchline. Step 3. The extension of those predicates is empty. The actual property of moral badness isn't found anywhere in the universe. We talk as if it's real, we act as if it's real, but it's not. Our entire moral way of talking is based on a huge shared error.
That is a wild thought. It suggests that every time we teach a kid right from wrong, we are, on a deep philosophical level, telling a falsehood. Useful one, maybe, but still a falsehood.
It's a profound claim.
So why? Why would anyone come to such an uncomfortable conclusion? What is so broken about morality that they think it's, fatally flawed?
Well, the sources lay out a few different arguments. It's not just one thing. It's more like a systemic failure.
Okay.
One line of attack is about autonomy. Some theorists argue that for morality to work, humans need to have this kind of total, unrestricted free will that, frankly, doesn't really line up with what science tells us.
So if our choices are determined or heavily constrained, then the whole idea of moral responsibility just falls apart.
Right. The system is built on a shaky idea about human freedom.
Then there's the really famous one, the argument about missing imperatives, which you always hear connected to the philosopher J.L. Mackie.
Yes, Mackie's argument from queerness. He said that for morality to be real and objective, there would have to be these strange, authoritative oughts just sort of floating around in the universe, commands that are binding on everyone no matter what they want or believe.
So like a rule that says you ought not lie.
Yeah.
That just exists out there in the fabric of reality.
Exactly. And Mackie just said, look, things like that are metaphysically queer. They're just too weird. They don't fit into a scientific picture of the world. And how would we even know about them? We'd need some kind of special moral sense.
So since the natural world doesn't seem to have these magical authoritative commands built into it, any moral claim based on them must be false.
The universe just doesn't take sides. That's the idea.
Which is different from just saying we disagree about morality. It's saying the thing we'd need to settle the disagreement doesn't exist.
Precisely. Then a third argument points to sociology, to the huge diversity of moral beliefs, the argument from a lack of uniformity.
You mean the fact that what one culture thinks is a moral duty, another thinks is horrible?
Right. If there were one objective moral truth out there, you'd expect over time that all rational people would start to converge on it. But we don't really see that. We see deep, intractable disagreement. And the best explanation for that disagreement might just be that there's no single truth to find.
That makes sense. And then there's a more scientific-sounding argument, the one about explanatory redundancy.
This one is very powerful. It basically says, look, can we explain everything we observe about human behavior, guilt, social rules, cooperation, condemnation, without ever needing to say that an actual, real moral property exists?
And the answer is probably yes, right? Using psychology, biology, sociology.
If the answer is yes, then the concept of moral badness becomes redundant. It's an unnecessary piece of theory. And in science, we tend to shave off the unnecessary bits. We have good reason to disbelieve in it.
And lastly, the sources mention an argument from defective origins.
Yeah, this is a historical argument. It traces our moral concepts, especially things like duty and obligation, back to their origins in, say, divine command theories or beliefs in supernatural bonds.
So if the foundation is rotten, if it's based on a belief in God or magic that we no longer hold, then the concepts built on top of that foundation are also defective.
That's the idea. So you have this huge multi-pronged attack. It concludes that morality as a system of objective, binding facts is just, well, a noble but failed project.
Okay, but there's a huge caveat here, which is what brings us back to our main question about self-interest. The era theorist's skepticism is usually very specific.
Yes, this is crucial. It's restricted to the moral realm. They don't doubt all forms of oughts or reasons.
They still believe in prudential normativity.
Absolutely. They believe there are real facts about what is good or bad for you. Facts about welfare, about self-interest, about what will cause you harm. They think individuals can be harmed and that they have good reasons to act in ways that protect their own well-being.
So to sum it up, the moral era theorist says prudential badness is real, but moral badness is not. They've gotten rid of one type of reason to act, the moral one, but they've kept the practical, self-interested one.
Which is why they aren't just paralyzed. They can still figure out what they should do. It's just that the should is now purely about what works best for them.
So, with that whole philosophical framework laid out, morality is a fiction, but prudence is real. How do they actually answer our question? Is it bad to be bad?
Well, the sources point out that first, there's a kind of tricky, logically correct, but useless answer, the vacuous answer.
Okay.
If you phrase the question as a strict conditional, if an action X is morally bad, then X is prudentially bad, the error theorist has to say, yes, that's true.
And that sounds like a huge concession. But you're saying it's a trick. Why is it a meaningless yes?
Because the first part of the statement, the if part, is always false. According to them, there are no morally bad actions.
Ah.
It's like saying if an animal is a unicorn, then it has a horn. Well, since there are no unicorns, you'll never find a counterexample, so the statement is technically true. But it tells you nothing useful about the world.
It's that witch analogy from the sources.
Exactly. If I ask you, is it bad to make a witch angry? Your first response should be, well, there are no witches, so you can't make one angry. The whole premise is flawed. So the conditional is vacuously true, but totally unhelpful.
Okay, so to get a real useful answer, the error theorist has to change the terms of the question.
They have to pivot. They move to what the sources call the substantive answer. And to do that, they have to reinterpret what morally bad means.
So instead of the philosophical definition, they just mean stuff that people think is morally bad.
Precisely. Actions that are widely conventionally condemned by society. Things like breaking promises, stealing, hurting people for no reason.
So the real interesting question becomes, if I do one of these things that everyone condemns, is that likely to backfire and harm my own interests?
Now you're asking a real empirical question, and this is where that great anthropology analogy comes in. Imagine you're an anthropologist in a culture that truly believes in evil spirits. You, as a scientist, don't believe they're real. But you would be incredibly foolish, prudentially speaking, not to follow the local customs for warding them off. You recognize that offending the locals by disrespecting their beliefs would have very real, very negative consequences for you, even if the beliefs themselves are false.
So the error theorist is basically that anthropologist. They don't believe in the moral facts, but they're smart enough to see the very real social consequences of ignoring what everyone else believes are moral facts.
They are playing a cynical but perfectly rational game. And what this leads to is the conclusion that the answer to the substantive question is, well, it's a mess. It's totally contingent.
That's not a simple yes or no.
Not at all. It can't be a universal law, which is exactly why that philosophical holy grail is so hard to find.
And that messiness, that contingency, shows up in a few ways. First, it changes from person to person.
Yeah, take the example of Ernie and Bert. They both tell the same small lie. Ernie, because of how he was raised or just his personality, is crushed by guilt. It eats him up, harms his well-being for years. For Ernie, that lie was deeply prudentially bad. Bert tells the same lie, feels nothing, and the only consequence is maybe he gets grounded for a weekend. For him, the benefits of the lie might have far outweighed that minor cost. It might have actually been a prudentially good move for Bert.
And it also varies by circumstance, obviously.
Of course. Stealing a chocolate bar when you're a kid gets you a lecture. Stealing that same chocolate bar as an adult could get you fired and a criminal record. Same act, wildly different prudential outcomes.
And the sources make another good point. Even when it is prudent for everyone to avoid a certain action, the reason it's prudent can be totally different for each person.
Right. One person avoids it because they fear punishment.
Yeah.
Another fears losing their reputation. A third person is just worried about their own guilty conscience. There's no single universal source for the prudential reason.
So the most honest answer the moral error theorist can give is a very unsatisfying, well, sometimes it's bad for you, sometimes it isn't, which is the complete opposite of that neat universal link philosophers have been searching for.
And that search for the universal link, for the proof that being immoral is always self-damaging, that's what we need to look at next, because that's the big philosophical project that tries to sweep all this messiness under the rug.
Right. The idea that no matter the circumstances, no matter who you are, acting immorally automatically harms your self-respect, and that loss of self-respect is the ultimate inescapable harm to your self-interest.
That's the holy grail argument. But the sources suggest it really starts to fall apart when you look at how people actually are, not how philosophical villains are supposed to be.
Okay, so we need to make a distinction here. A distinction between the, what's the term? The pleonectic?
The pleonectic, yes, and the everyday wrongdoer.
The pleonectic is like the ultimate philosophical bad guy. The kind of person who has consciously rejected all morality and just lives to maximize their own power and gain no matter who gets hurt.
A Thrasymachus figure, right.
Yeah.
And you could make a plausible case that a person who is that extreme, that all-encompassing in their selfishness, might well be self-damaging. They might live a life of total isolation, paranoia.
But the point is, almost no one is actually like that.
Exactly. The sources call that an empirical ghost. Most real-world wrongdoing isn't done by these supervillains. It's done by regular people. The person who cheats a little on their taxes, the guy who's rude to a cashier, the loyal mafia soldier who acts out of a twisted sense of duty to his crew.
And these people are masters of rationalization and compartmentalization. They don't see themselves as evil.
And then that's the core of the critique. The kind of deep psychological harm that the extreme pleonectic might suffer just does not scale down to the mundane, everyday wrongdoer.
Okay, let's take an example. The argument about true love and friendship.
Right. The Holy Grail argument says that immorality destroys your self-respect, and without genuine self-respect, you can't have genuine love or friendship. And since those things are crucial for a good life, every immoral person is harming themselves.
That sounds pretty convincing on the surface. But what about our everyday wrongdoer? The guy who cheats a business rival he dislikes. Does that one act really prevent him from having a truly loving relationship with his wife and kids?
It seems very, very unlikely. The argument needs that one lapse to poison all of his genuine relationships. And that's just a massive leap. Plus, as the sources point out, everyone has to turn away from potential friendships. We can't be friends with the whole world. It seems arbitrary to say that this one transgression against an outsider automatically ruins the genuine bonds he has with his inner circle.
It feels like they're forcing the conclusion.
It does, and you see the same problem with the argument about psychological compartmentalization.
The idea being that the immoral person has to split their mind into pieces to live with themselves, and that this fragmentation is inherently damaging.
Again, we have to be careful. Is extreme pathological compartmentalization harmful? Yes, absolutely. But a little bit of compartmentalization, that's not a pathology, that's just a normal part of being a functional human.
We all do it. You put on your work self, then you come home and your family self. You hear a horrible news story, and you have to compartmentalize that horror to get through your day.
Exactly. So if the universal argument insists that our minor task sheet must be suffering from the same pathological fragmentation as a serial killer, it's just begging the question. It's assuming the conclusion it needs to prove. The scaling just doesn't work.
And this all leads to the irrationality challenge. Let's say a philosopher spends years writing a brilliant book, proving that the immoral person's sense of self-worth is based on a subtle self-deception.
A faulty simulacrum of self-respect.
How does proving that cognitive error automatically translate into a real, tangible harm to their well-being?
That's the logical gap. I mean, if the self-deception is so subtle that it takes 2,000 years of philosophy to even spot it, how can it be causing the kind of obvious harm that comes from, believing you can fly and jumping off a building? It just doesn't follow.
And we also have to question this built-in assumption that the joy of seeing things as they are always wins. That knowing the truth about your flawed character is a greater good than the actual benefits you got from your transgression.
Yes. There's satisfaction in being honest, sure. But there's also a pretty big satisfaction that comes from getting that promotion you cheated to get, or just from getting away with something. To assume the philosophical joy always outweighs the practical benefit is, again, just wishful thinking.
So the error theorist looks at all of this and says the whole project fails. The link is messy, it's contingent, it is not universal.
And crucially, even if you could prove it, even if being moral was always the most prudent course of action, that still wouldn't prove the error theorist wrong. They'd just say, yeah, it's prudent, but that doesn't mean objective moral facts exist. It just means evolution and society have shaped us that way.
Okay, so we've seen that the weak claim that bad acts are just imprudent is messy. But now we need to tackle the really extreme claim, the idea of complete identification, the claim that moral badness is the very same thing as imprudence.
That morality is just a kind of enlightened long-term self-interest and nothing more.
To test this, we first need to be really clear on the structure of prudence.
And it's simple. Prudential normativity is always, always about primary self-harm. An action is imprudent because it harms the person doing it. End of story. If that person somehow avoids being harmed, the prudential reason against it just disappears.
Right. Drinking coffee late at night is imprudent for me because I can't sleep. If I could take a pill that let me sleep perfectly after drinking coffee, it would no longer be imprudent for me to do it.
The norm is retracted. Absolutely. So let's take that structure and apply it to a moral case. And we have to pick a really extreme one, an action that is, by anyone's definition, a moral crime.
And the sources use the most powerful example possible, the SS guard thought experiment. An SS guard knowingly herding children into a gas chamber. This is our test case for a moral atrocity.
Now let's try on the idea that the wrongness of that action is identical to, and nothing more than, its imprudence, the harm it does to the guard himself. If we accept that, we are forced into some truly appalling conclusions.
Okay, conclusion number one.
We have to accept that what primarily makes the guard's action wrong is that he harmed himself. The core of the wrongness is self-directed.
Conclusion two. The harm to the victims, the children, all that suffering is only derivative. It only matters to the extent that hurting them ended up hurting him. Maybe it damaged his soul or put him at risk of being caught later.
Yes. And conclusion three, which is maybe the most shocking, the sheer scale of his crime, the magnitude of the evil, must be measured by the magnitude of his own self-injury. The deaths of thousands of people are, from a structural point of view, only as bad as the damage he did to his own long-term interests.
And then the final test, the counterfactual.
This is the killer. If that guard committed those atrocities, but through some magic or just a quirk of his psychology, he managed to avoid any self-harm, he was a psychopath who felt no guilt, he escaped South America, lived a long, happy life, Then, by the logic of this identification,
Then there was nothing wrong with his actions.
nothing wrong at all, morally or prudentially.
And that's monstrous. The intuitive revulsion we feel at that conclusion is the evidence. Whatever morality is, it isn't structured like that. The wrongness has to be primarily about the victims, not the perpetrator.
That's the total structural failure, and we can break it down into a few specific features that show why they're so different.
Okay.
First, there's the idea of transgression. When you do something imprudent, like overtraining for a race and getting hurt, it's foolish. It's something you ought not have done. But it's not a moral transgression. No one condemns you for it.
Right. And then there are the emotional profiles. They're completely different.
When someone harms themselves out of foolishness, our reaction is pity. When someone commits a moral crime like the guard, our reaction is retributive anger, indignation. We don't pity the immoral, we condemn them.
And the internal feeling is different, too. When you do something stupid that hurts yourself, you feel, well, stupid. You don't feel this specific moral emotion of guilt.
Exactly. If prudence was morality, the SS guard's primary feeling should be, wow, I was so stupid to risk my future happiness, not, I am guilty of a monstrous crime against humanity.
And finally, what about reparations?
If the primary victim is the criminal himself, then making reparations to the external victims is only justified if it's the best way for the criminal to make himself feel better.
So he might decide that paying back the people he stole from is less efficient for his own mental health than, say, going on a nice vacation to forget about it.
And that would be the perfectly rational, prudential thing to do. Apologies and compensation become just one possible therapeutic tool among many for fixing the self-inflicted damage.
It's just so obviously not what we mean by morality.
It's a total mismatch. So the error theorists can stand their ground. They can say, look, even if acting nicely happens to be prudent most of the time, the two systems are fundamentally different. You haven't saved morality by reducing it to self-interest.
Okay, so the error theorist has made their case. Moral facts don't exist. And prudence, the closest stand-in, is structurally just not up to the job. So what do they do now? How do they live?
Well, they have a choice. They can be an eliminativist and argue we should just get rid of moral language altogether. Or they can be a fictionalist and argue we should keep using the language, but, with our fingers crossed.
And this is where that term you used earlier comes in, schmorality.
Right. The error theorist has concluded that any normative system that actually exists and that we can believe in, like prudence or maybe some form of relativism, is missing that special ingredient of objective authority that we think morality has. They're not the real thing. They're schmoralities.
And prudence, as the SS Guard example showed, is a really poor schmorality. It just doesn't work.
It doesn't. So the choice between getting rid of the language or just pretending with it really comes down to what you think the function of morality is.
Which brings us to moral fictionalism.
Yeah.
The idea here is that a concept can be theoretically false, but practically indispensable.
It's a purely pragmatic move, the fictionalist says. I'm going to keep on saying things like stealing is wrong. I'm going to think moral thoughts.
Right.
But I'm going to consciously withhold a sartoric force when I say it, and I'm going to withhold doxastic assent, actual genuine belief from the thought.
Okay, that's a key distinction. I have doxastic assent to the idea that the sun will rise tomorrow. I truly believe it. The fictionalist refuses to give moral statements that same level of belief.
Right. They use the system to get all the practical benefits. It helps society run smoothly. It motivates them personally. But they do it without ever violating their core intellectual commitment that it's all based on a falsehood.
But that position is going to face some pretty serious objections. The first one seems obvious. Doesn't this just collapse into endorsement? If your reason for using moral language is that it's good for you, aren't you just saying morality is prudence?
This is where we need to be really precise about the difference between instrumental justification and epistemic justification. Imagine someone puts a gun to your head and says, say the sky is green or I'll shoot. You're going to say the sky is green. Your act of saying it is instrumentally justified. It's the smart, prudent thing to do. But it doesn't make the statement the sky is green true. Believing it is still epistemically unjustified.
I see. So the fictionalist's motive for using moral language might be prudence, But that doesn't change the truth value of the moral claims themselves. They're still false.
Exactly. And you can even see this work on a psychological level. Think about it. You can be selfishly motivated to develop genuinely unselfish feelings.
How so?
Well, you might realize that to have true friends who love you, you need to actually genuinely care about them for their own sake. So your initial motive is self-interested, but the emotion you end up cultivating is genuinely altruistic. The motive and the end state are different things.
That's a great point. But it leads straight into the second big objection, the incoherence of acceptance versus belief. If someone talks like a moralist, acts like a moralist, and feels like a moralist almost all the time, can they really maintain this fine-tuned mental separation? Isn't it just bad faith or some kind of psychological mess?
It's a very strong objection. But the defense rests on the idea that the fictionalist always maintains the ability to step out. They have what's called a critical context.
Which is basically the philosophy seminar room.
It could be. It's that moment of reflection when, if you press them on it, they are prepared to deny the existence of objective moral truth. They might spend 99% of their life acting and talking as if it's real, but they hold on to that one disposition to deny it when the foundations are being questioned.
And the power of that critical context isn't about how much time you spend in it.
No, it's about its asymmetry. The philosophical context gets to critique the assumptions of everyday talk, but everyday talk doesn't get to critique the philosophical foundations. That one-way relationship is what keeps the distinction alive.
And the fictionalist isn't alone in doing this kind of thing. The sources talk about partners in innocence.
Right. We do this all the time. When you get lost in a novel, you accept the reality of the story without believing the characters are real people. When you empathize with someone, you simulate their perspective. It doesn't mean you're having a psychotic break. The fictionalist is just applying that same mental tool to morality.
Okay, so it might be psychologically possible, but what is the practical use? Why do we need this fiction?
Well, one proposed use is what David Lewis called browbeating. Moral language has a special rhetorical force. It carries an authority that purely instrumental language, you should do this because it's good for you, just doesn't have.
And that leads to this motivational hypothesis.
Yes, the idea that moral thinking is a really useful tool against our own weaknesses. Weakness of will, discounting the future.
Right. If I'm tempted to do something I know is bad for me in the long run, thinking this is not in my best interest is a pretty weak defense. I can easily talk myself out of that.
But thinking, I just can't do this, it's wrong. That feels different. That feels like an imperative, a hard stop. It's just more motivating. And if that's true, then fictionalism, which lets us keep that motivational tool, is a much better option than just eliminating it.
But doesn't that raise one final, really technical problem? If you tie moral judgment so tightly to motivation, aren't you just becoming a non-cognitivist? And if you do that, the whole error theory, which depends on cognitivism, falls apart.
That's a very subtle but important objection, but it rests on a misunderstanding. It's perfectly fine for a cognitivist to say that a moral judgment, which is a belief, reliably causes or is associated with the motivational state.
The belief and the motivation are two different things. They just happen to show up together.
Exactly. The analogy from the sources about promising is perfect here. For me to make a promise to you, it's necessary that I believe you can hear me. But the promise itself isn't an expression of that belief. The promise expresses an intention. In the same way, a moral judgment won't necessarily be linked to motivation, but that doesn't mean the judgment is just an expression of the motivation. So the error theorist can hold it all together. They can say, moral judgments are false beliefs, but they are incredibly useful fictions because they reliably trigger these very helpful, non-prudential motivational states in us.
And so, the fictionalist finds a way, a coherent, pragmatic path to being a good, functional person without ever having to believe in a moral reality that they think just isn't there.
And that's really where this deep dive leaves us. We've used this incredibly skeptical idea, moral error theory, as a lens. And not to destroy ethics, but actually to get a clearer picture of what it's built on.
Right. The error theorist forces us to conclude that objective moral facts, as we usually think of them, probably don't exist.
And we saw that the big philosophical dream to prove that being bad is always bad for you just doesn't seem to hold up. It works for cartoon villains, but not for real everyday people.
And that SS Guard thought experiment, it showed just how monstrous it is to try and replace morality with simple self-interest. Prudence is a schmorality. It's a terrible substitute for the real thing.
But I think the most important takeaway for you, for anyone listening, is that the moral skeptic doesn't have to be a villain. They're not forced to be nasty or selfish.
Even if they think the best they can do is live by a schmorality, they still have a ton of really strong, non-moral reasons to be a good person. Reasons like compassion, loyalty, a desire for a peaceful society, and just plain complex self-interest. For most of us, most of the time, those non-moral reasons line up almost perfectly with what morality would have demanded anyway.
Which leaves us with a final kind of provocative question to chew on. If acting morally is just the most successful, most expedient, and least psychologically painful way for most of us to get through life, whether or not there are any universal moral facts floating out there in the cosmos, then does the truth of morality really matter as much as its incredible usefulness?